As you can see, my name is Sean Deuby, and my title is Principal Technologist for North America for Semperis. And I'm an identity person. I've been an identity person forever. There was some confusion as to whether or not I was going to make it here in time, because I did an event in Tempe last night and took an ODark 30 flight here today, and then I went to the hotel room to lay down for a second. There's this great big pool. I was like, great, I'm going to jump in the pool for a second, refresh, which was wonderful. And then I get in, and then I could not get back into the hotel. So I shook on fences and things like that, and eventually I had to jump the fence. As I'm jumping the fence, I'm thinking Jeremy's going to say, I'm sorry, our speaker couldn't make it tonight because he's now in the hospital because he fell into the lake next to the pool. But it worked out fine. So my background, very briefly, because no one really cares that much about it. I've been doing identity. I've been doing Microsoft identity as long as Microsoft has been doing identity, if you can parse that out. As he was saying, back when I was 9 years old, I started with LAN Manager and Windows NT and specifically really Windows 2000. And I spent 15 years with Texas Instruments, 10 with Intel. I was one of Intel's original Active Directory architects, and then helped run it for 10 years, 15-time MVP for identity for Microsoft. Technology Journal, so I've got a lot of articles out there, and I've sort of come back full circle in my career back to Active Directory and identity again, because identity is become the center of what people pay attention to, what security people, if they're not, they should be, and that's part of the idea behind this conversation today. Let me ask you, how many people are security professionals in here? Okay, and how many are in the academic world? Okay. How many of you would consider yourselves identity professionals? Okay. Well, that answers my second question. So my last question. So I'll skip over that. I've been an identity professional for basically 23 years. Before Microsoft came out with Active Directory, we just called ourselves administrators. then we became identity professionals, and if you're really good, then you get to call yourself an identirati. So what is this about today? If I had to put it into 2 words what this talk is about, it's about protecting identity. Okay, that's it. Protect identity. I'm going to sort of lay out 4 fundamental premises. Some are pretty short, some are a little bit longer. The first is that identity is fundamental to an organization's security and operational resilience. The second is that most cyber attacks actually start with identity compromise. The third is that to mitigate identity risk requires specific ITDR, identity threat detection and response solutions. And the last, and I'll certainly pound this to death by the time we're done here, is that identity depends on Active Directory and it's always a target. Now, given the spread of people that we have in the audience, I'm going to do a little bit of Active Directory 101. There'll be those of you whose eyes will roll up in your head. Go ahead, look at your phones while I do that. But for those of you that haven't familiar with it, it's very important to understand fundamentally how important and yet sort of forgotten this technology is. So in the last few years, and I've been attending identity conferences for many, many years, and they used to be, I went to there's a large conference called Identiverse, and that's got 2,000, 3,000 people going to it. And the first one had 200 people in a conference, not in a conference room, but in a ballroom up in the Rockies that Ping Identity sponsored. And since then, it has grown and grown and grown as people have become to recognize how fundamental identity is to security and to everything that we do in the modern technology world today. It started out, of course, by keeping legacy environments secure, and I'll dive into what the fundamentals of what Active Directory is and what it does. But then the next thing that it started to do is enable what the marketing people call the digital transformation. In other words, taking on-premises and starting to adopt cloud services on top of your existing on-premises. Those of you that have been around for a while would remember when cloud first came out, it was, oh, you're just going to do everything to the public cloud right away and one size fits all. And then all the organizations said, no. And then they went, well, okay, how about a private cloud? And then some people tried that, and that didn't go very far. And so now we have, as so often happens in life, a combination of the two. We have a hybrid cloud environment where, let's face it, we have substantial investments on premises, but we're now doing things out in the cloud that are not going to go away. And unlike some vendors or many vendors would like us to believe, the on-premises part is not going away anytime soon. And then finally, identity has become a building block of zero trust. So if you dig up the NIST 800-207 Zero Trust Framework, the 6th pillar of it is to, and actually I'll quote it directly because I can't remember very well, authentication and authorization are dynamic and strictly enforced before resource access is granted. And authentication and access control, authorization, depend upon identity. So identity is a building block of the Zero Trust framework that everybody talks about now. If you can't trust identity, or if your identity systems are compromised, your whole Zero Trust framework falls down because the threat actor has gained the high ground on that. Number 2, as I said before, cyber attacks start with identity compromise. This is a quote from Alex Weinert, who is the Vice President of Identity Security at Microsoft. He's been having a very hard summer. He actually keynoted at our HIP conference 2 weeks ago in New York City, along with General David Petraeus, but that's another story. What he says is that more often than not, attacks like ransomware are the second stage, predicated by an identity compromise. Somebody gets phished, typically. Then they have the identity, then they get in, then they launch their ransomware campaign. If you read all the attention-grabbing headlines, you'll find that most novel techniques rely on compromising identity first. And that's actually a really important learning from the Solaragate, Nobelium, SolarWinds fiasco. One of the things that came out of that, and I'll go into that in a little bit of more detail in a second. And the other is a cliche, but it's true. Attackers don't break in, they log in. They get the credentials, they log in like a legitimate user to get on the network, and then start spreading and doing what they want to do. So, what's this about identity threat detection and response? And what does it mean? And how does it mitigate cyber attack risk? So ITDR, Identity Threat Detection and Response, and it's taken me a long time to say that correctly because I hear ITDR and I think IT and DR, but it's not. I like this summary right here. So ITDR, as security people, we're used to protecting credentials. Credentials. ITDR is about secure operation of the identity infrastructure rather than the protection of individual users and resources managed by the infrastructure. Sure, you have to protect those credentials, but this is about protecting the service itself, which, as you'll see, is regularly and relentlessly attacked. 90%, the reality is, Gartner talks about ITDR, but 90% of it really is about Active Directory threat detection and response. So they call it AD-TDR. So Active Directory threat detection and response tools fulfill this mission by discovering indicators of exposure and indicators of compromise in Active Directory. And there are variations of this, and I won't go too deeply into it, but that in a nutshell is what it's about. It's to have a preventative function and a detective function, because Active Directory has got, a world full of holes because it's been around longer than some of you who've been around. I've seen some of you in here have been alive, but I won't point any fingers. Yeah, so there you go. How many of you have heard of the Gartner hype cycle? Okay, some of you. Okay, this is good to know. So Gartner came up with this idea, or they came up with this framework some brilliant person had a blinding flash of the obvious, and they figured out that the adoption of any new technology or any new idea sort of goes through this cycle. So what you have is you have the innovation trigger at the bottom. I'll have to do that. It still doesn't show. But you have the innovation trigger, which is where you first become aware of it. And then more and more people become aware of it. Then you have the peak of inflated expectations. This is the, wow, man, this is better than sliced bread. And then right about here, it starts to fall apart. You have the trough of disillusionment, which is, well, but it doesn't butter your bread. And so you sort of forget about it. And then over time, you have the slope of enlightenment and the plateau of productivity. That's where you just start using bread for your sandwiches. So you can take pretty much any technology, and so Gartner has really capitalized on this. They have a hype cycle across all of their technologies. This is one for SecOps in 2022. And here's ITDR marching its way quickly up the slope. And in 2022, they predicted that ITDR will see mainstream adoption faster than any other category in this innovation trigger phase. And they're predicting the same thing for 2023, rapid adoption, because as I'm starting to use UC, identity as a target. Where does identity fit in the security landscape? Squarely in the middle. So you have traditional identity and access management, IAM. Those of you that are IAM people and you work in identity, these are the very complex systems that basically are the underpinning of so much of what we do every day. What you're able to access, what you can log on to, when you have HR come in and put things in, take things out. And then of course you have the best known of security tools, XDR or EDR, for your endpoints, for your clients, for your servers, looking at threats, mitigating threats, preventing things from getting any worse. ITDR fits in the middle because it's not XDR and it's not IAM. It protects IAM and it has some elements of XDR in it. One of the differences is that there are XDR tools that protect servers, and Active Directory is propagated on servers called domain controllers. And some of our largest customers have 550 domain controllers around the world. That's a big Active Directory. So these XDR tools protect the physical domain controllers, the servers, they're Windows servers with a role on top of them, from threats, well, malware and that sort of thing, whereas what ITDR focuses more on the actual service itself. What's running on inside the service. So how does AD relate to identity threat detection and all these cyber attacks that we're talking about? So this is where the folks that have been around the block can just pull up their phone and start looking at the Wall Street Journal or dark reading. But about Active Directory. So this is a couple slides on what sort of an AD 101. For many years, people would ask me, what did I do for a living? And I said, oh, I'm an Active Directory expert. And I apologize, this is a really lousy seat for you guys. I'm an Active Directory expert. And they say, well, what's Active Directory? And I try to explain it, and it doesn't make sense until I hit on the idea of, you know, when you go into the office and you sit down in the morning and you hit Control-Alt-Delete, or nowadays you just hit Control, and you get this screen, and you have to put a user ID in, and then it asks for your email address, or if you were around long enough, it asks for your domain. And I said, that's Active Directory. And everybody goes, oh, okay, now I got it. So there, we're done. You now learn what Active Directory is. What Active Directory really is to an IAM person is really four things, is what we call the 4 A's of identity and access management. It is authentication, who you are. You log into the network for the first time. You can or you can't log in using a security protocol called Kerberos. Then there is the authorization, also known as access control, what you're allowed to access. So when you log into Active Directory for the first time, you get a security token. And in that security token is a list of security identifiers that says all the groups that you're a member of, and therefore the different kind of resources on the network you're allowed to access or not to access. You may be able to get to financial stuff. You may not be able to get to HR stuff. Very, very important. Auth-N and Auth-Z. Then there is account management, which is an IT pro, is all about managing user IDs, groups, computers. It's the account lifecycle, which we call CRUD. Create, read, update, and delete, the lifecycle. And I was talking to a gentleman before here about governance and how important governance is and what a nightmare. And so, sorry, governance is the process of managing this life cycle, being able to pay attention and watching them created, making sure things are deleted, being able to attest that they've been deleted, something that is generally woefully ignored in Active Directory. And finally, audit, proving who did what. Audit logs, of course. Security professionals, audit logs. You're all about audit logs. Oh, and one last little tidbit. So 90% of organizations with more than 500 employees around the world have Active Directory installed, and most of them depend on it for day-to-day critical business operations. So for the folks of you that have not heard of it and all that, AD is ubiquitous on-premise, and you can look that word up, is ubiquitous in on-premises networks and is not going anywhere despite what marketing hype says. We do regular webinars. I've done 2 webinars with more than 100 people in it, and I pose the question, when is your organization going to get off of Active Directory, which, as I think I implied, is 23 years old now. When are you going to get off of Active Directory? And 75% in both circumstances said never. Correct. So you folks that are in college and university and getting into the business and all of that. Shameless plug, I also do a podcast called the Hybrid Identity Protection Podcast, the HIP podcast on identity security. And in there, on one episode, I pose what I call the COBOL corollary. So those of you that have got some white hair or no hair are well familiar with COBOL, a business language that's been around since God hung the moon. And what's not widely recognized is that organizations still depend on it, absolutely. Now, COBOL may not, and the people that know it are retiring. And there are not that many of them, seeing nodding heads here. So, career advice, if you find that you don't mind looking at something like COBOL, you will have a job a well-paying job for the rest of your life. And I call it the COBOL corollary because we're starting to see the same thing in Active Directory. The original AD experts are starting to retire. So in our company, I and my colleagues see a lot of Active Directory environments, and we're seeing second-generation administrators. And one of the aspects of the security aspects of this is that they don't know why things were done the way they were, and they're afraid to touch them because they're production applications. So developing Active Directory skills is a good career move. I'll put it like that. So much better than the COBOL. Now, forget about the COBOL. Just remember the Active Directory skill set. So what does that actually look like in the real world? I spent 5 years as an IAM consultant for hybrid stuff. In the real world, what does an identity architecture look like? It's really complicated. It isn't not nearly as simple as what I just showed you a little before. What you have in the center, of course, because I'm an AD guy, so AD is at the center, is Active Directory. Now, you have to populate Active Directory with information. And so one of the primary sources for Active Directory information are HR systems, when somebody onboards. So that's where you have new users created and groups and roles input into Active Directory. That's one of the places one of the inputs for AD. But there's also on-premises databases as well. I worked with some very large technology companies. They populate full-time employees, FTEs, through a PeopleSoft or a SuccessFactors or a Bamboo HR. But their contractor database is some ancient thing that's been around forever. And then they've got a few other databases for various things because they figure it all ought to be in Active Directory. And then they munge it all together with what's called a metadirectory server. So that populates into Active Directory. So now you've got everything that you need in Active Directory, and you can start sharing it with everything else. So these are all the things on premises that you care about and are near and dear to your heart. Administrative servers, security servers, backup servers, web servers, databases, SQL Server databases, line of business servers, all depend on Active Directory either directly for authentication, or they'll copy user IDs across in ways that we don't really want to get into because it's ugly, but they depend on it. Then, of course, you have the hybrid thing that I'm talking about. This is hybrid identity, where you take AD identities and you project them out into a cloud service provider, such as Azure Active Directory or AWS or Okta. So this is how you get hybrid identity. This is how you get single sign-on into Office 365 or Salesforce or Zoom or Expensify or any number of SaaS applications. From a security professional's point of view, you've got to have SSO into these SaaS applications, because that's how you control access. That's how you can grant access, remove access. That's how your users can use their corporate user ID and password to log in. You don't want another identity source. You don't want them to use another identity source. So as you can see, it gets complicated. And finally, to bring things full circle in the great circle of life, identity that is, you get SSO back into the SaaS app, back into the HR applications. So you take Active Directory out of the middle of there, and you're in big trouble. And that's what this is essentially saying. AD is mission critical. An AD security outage, severe catastrophic impact, cloud identity, zero trust, always talked about it. So I've beaten this to death. AD is central to your modern security infrastructure. And the safety of AD is at the center of your modern security infrastructure. So what happens? Everybody goes after AD. Mandiant says that 90% of attacks that they investigate for their customers involve Active Directory in some form, either attacking Active Directory directly or going through AD to get to the databases and other resources that they want to gather from. And that is what happened in SolarWinds, inside of SolarWinds. Gartner says attackers are targeting AD and the identity infrastructure with phenomenal success. And I have the opportunity to talk to a number of CISOs over time, and one of them told me, and this really resonated, he said, 90%? That's low. I've been looking at pen test reports for 10 years, and it's 100%. So what does that look like? What that looks like, and if you're security professionals, you're familiar with this, is an attack kill chain, right? So this is an AD-focused attack kill chain. So you have the initial client access, and what's happening now, because cybercrime is big business with all capital letters, the labor has been divided up in cybercrime. So you have initial access brokers, and that's all they do, is they gain initial access. They break in, and then they sell the credentials on the dark web, and then they go to the next place. And then the threat actors that want to go in further simply buy the credentials. They get the credentials. Obviously, everybody talks about phishing. And we're hearing more about MFA attacks, MFA fatigue attacks, SMS attacks, even attacks through authenticator pushes. Single factor VPN on the network, breach replay, password spray. How many of you are familiar with what password spray is? Okay. Fair amount of you. For the balance of you, I'll explain it. When you think of attacks against credentials, traditionally what you think of is brute force attacks. You get a hold of a user ID and you just jam on it and you try until you try to come up with the right password for it. That throws off all sorts of alarms in modern technology right now. There's a much easier way. It's what I call brute force turned upside down, which is password spray. So instead of one account that you try multiple passwords across, you have multiple accounts that are easily obtainable on the dark web for an organization, and you try the 25 or 30 most common passwords against those accounts, one after another. And it's phenomenally successful. password spray attacks are super, super successful because they are attacking, and this is the bane of the security professional, is that you can get as sophisticated as you want, but your limiting factor is the wetware that is your users and what they can do, and the credentials that they give away, and the how strong a password that can they remember without falling into patterns that computers can immediately suss out and take care of. So what a password spray does is it looks up the most common passwords, tries it against there, and you'd be astonished at how often it works. A bit of advice just off the top of my head on here. There are, for Active Directory, for when you try to change your password or enter a password in Active Directory, it goes through something called a password filter. And Microsoft has password filters that come out of the box. But you can buy third-party password filters that collect a list of the most common passwords and will prevent your user from being able to change to the most common password. If you have a hybrid environment where you've got Azure Active Directory P1, they have a great utility called Azure AD Password Protection, which it's not very well known at all. And that is a hybrid service that will block common passwords in your on-premises environment. Super, super valuable, and you've already paid for it if you have the basic version of Azure Active Directory. And I still won't say Entra ID yet. So this is the realm of EDR and XDR. What are we doing on the clients, right? The recon on the clients, propagation on the clients, and the servers. Where Active Directory comes in is right here. Boy, threat actors love Active Directory because it was designed for a time when if you authenticated to the network, it was designed to make it easy to find resources. That's one of the reasons it was so popular. So if a threat actor is in a legitimate login, they can look in and they can look at these resources and they can find, for example, something that every security professional should know about is something called Kerber roasting. Kerber roasting is a way to gain control over Active Directory, too soon, is a way to gain control over Active Directory in a matter of minutes, and it's very hard to prevent. All you can do is protect against it, and I'll talk about that some other time. But look up Kerber roasting as an attack technique. CrowdStrike says that the Kerber roasting technique in the last 12 months, threat actors, the use of Kerber roasting has increased by 583% in the last 12 months. That's how effective it is. So this is the realm for ITDR, Identity Threat Detection and Response. Reconnaissance through Active Directory, propagation, escalation as the threat actor looks through the environment and finds administrative credentials on other clients, or they Kerber roast and gain administrative rights on Active Directory. Once they gain administrative rights on Active Directory, it's game over. Most modern organizations, they're on premises, most of it is Active Directory integrated. Not entirely, not all of the apps, but most of it. And once they gain control of Active Directory, they can go to the SQL servers, they can go to whatever databases, they can go to the applications and own it and exfiltrate. If it's a double extortion, they can exfiltrate the data, and then the last thing they do before they go out the door is trigger the ransomware, trigger the encryption, and encrypt it. And there you are. Oh, and yes, so the modern version of this now is once they have gained control of on-premises Active Directory, they can escalate and get into Azure Active Directory. So the SolarWinds, how many of you are familiar with the SolarWinds exploit? Yeah, by now most of you folks are. I think what is not so commonly known, so SolarWinds threat actors compromised SolarWinds Orion software, which allowed them to gain a foothold on premises. What they did is they gained control of Active Directory. In almost 100% of the cases, they gained control. They owned on-prem Active Directory, which is what allowed them to log in as administrators on ADFS and forge SAML tokens, which then for the all these organizations used ADFS. Office 365 Azure Active Directory says, oh, okay, that's a valid token, I trust you. And that's how they got in. But they compromised on premises first. So, what can you do about this? What are the steps that you can take to increase your security and decrease the likelihood of attacking? And I'm not going to say that you can't be attacked, but I'm a big believer in what I call the bear camping analogy, which is if you're out camping with your friends, you don't have to be faster than the bear that you encounter when you're out camping. You just have to be faster than your friends. So your environment may not be bulletproof, but if you make it hard enough, unless you have a really determined threat actor, they'll go someplace where it's easier. Because remember, this is cyber crime, which means I think of it as capitalism without a conscience. So they want to make as much money as they can, as easily as they can, as quickly as they can. If they get mired in some environment where it's taking too long and it's causing them trouble and they're afraid they're going to get caught, I'll spend another $400 for another set of credentials for another organization and go in and break them instead. So Gartner's specific ITDR guidance is evaluate ITDR tools, ADTDR tools, prioritize tools that implement security posture assessment and real-time monitoring. So in Active Directory, security posture assessment is super important because depending on the age of your organization, that AD may have been in production for almost a quarter century. And imagine a quarter century of hurried choices that may have not been the most secure choice. Because somebody's breathing down your neck because they want that application in place. Okay, I'll just give them admin rights, and it works. And you take that and you multiply that by 23 years. And detective is the harder thing to do. Use guidance and use industry standards such as MITRE or the ANSI framework in France or the MITRE attack framework, because that shows you where these attacks fit in or where the weaknesses fit in. And finally, prepare for the unexpected, which to me means recovery. And I'm going to talk a little bit about recovery because that's one of my soapboxes, because it can be existentially dangerous and people don't know about it. So this is essentially the NIST cybersecurity framework. Identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And so we have a Semperis, so as an identity company, an identity protection company, we have a couple of free tools to help you and yours and anyone that you want to increase the security of your on-premises Active Directory system. So in this particular one, this is what we call before the attack. Identify the threats, identify the vulnerabilities, and protect against them. So by doing vulnerability assessments and doing indicator of exposure and indicator of compromise discovery. So this tool is called Purple Knight. How many of you have heard of Purple Knight? We have gotten to the point that some people have actually heard of it. Wow, that's great. More than 10,000 downloads. I think it's more than that because what is it? 20,000 downloads, Jeremy says. 20,000 downloads. It is a free tool, absolutely free. We don't see anything that it generates. It's entirely all your own. It doesn't phone home. Everything that it runs, it's a collection of signed, quite sophisticated PowerShell scripts that examines about 150 different vulnerabilities in on-premises Active Directory. And it will spit out, it's about a 75-page report. It puts them in order of urgency. It shows where they map into the MITRE attack framework or in the ANSI framework. It gives you guidance on how to remediate it. And it gives you a score, which is a pretty sobering thing because almost nobody gets a good score the first time they run Purple Knight. And Purple Knight not only runs against Active Directory, it runs against Azure Active Directory, and as of a couple weeks ago, it also runs against Okta. So if any of you have Okta installations, this will also look at some basic security indicators, indicators of exposure in your Okta environment. So you can sort of see what it is. It doesn't require any rights in your Active Directory. It doesn't require any rights on the domain join client that you run it from. about half of the people I talk to, they're security people. They'll say, about half say, I better tell my SOC that I'm going to run this. And the other half said, no, I'm not going to tell my SOC that I'm going to run this, and I want to see what happens. So Purple Knight is very, very popular, and deservedly so. The other is called Forest Druid. And Forest Druid is a more sophisticated tool that does attack path analysis. So how many of you are familiar with Bloodhound? A few folks are familiar with Bloodhound. So I like to think of Forest Druid as Bloodhound upside down. So the concept of attack path analysis is that a threat actor will get into the environment, and then they will follow a path until they get to domain admin. And that might be one step, or it might be two steps, if like Kerberoasting, or it could be 3 or 4 or 10 different steps. And so the point behind attack path analysis tools is to show you these things that are not at all obvious. Oh, this user is in here, and they're part of this group, but this group has write control of this GPO, and this GPO has control over is linked to the domain controller's OU. And therefore, that user can actually control domain controllers. That's what an attack path analysis tool does. What Forest Druid does is it does it from the inside out. Instead of looking at all the attack paths in the organization, what it does is it starts at tier 0. And tier 0 are your domain controllers, your domain admin group, the stuff that controls your environment. And then it looks out from tier 0, and it looks what are the paths into those. So you can sort of see it, not very well, but we have both a graphical one and a database version of this. And it shows you your vulnerabilities, the number of steps to tier 0. We have found organizations that have 70,000 steps to tier 0. Or I just heard this morning, our incident response team, they typically find, for example, when they have called in an incident response, that the help desk have domain admin rights. So they can reset the domain administrator's password if they need it. I mean, you can imagine what a Forest Druid attack graph looks like that. Both free tools. This is a little more complicated to understand. Going around the graph, this is during the attack. Threat detection and visibility and auto remediation and incident response. We don't have free tools for that, but we have a subscription tool called Directory Services Protector that has a patented process that actually sits in Active Directory like a domain controller and captures all of the changes that are going on in AD, which in a large organization can be tens of thousands per day. And it tracks all of it. And if you see an unauthorized or you get an alert for an unauthorized change, you can check a checkbox and say undo. And it'll undo a deleted OU. It'll undo a threat actor making a change to a user ID for persistence. It'll undo everything. And it'll do that manually, or you can write rules to automatically do that. If anybody is added to an administrative group in Active Directory, immediately roll it back before any human can see what has happened and send an alert. So that's a Directory Services Protector. It also does these security assessments that Purple Knight does once. This does it continuously, and if something falls out, it will fix that. And then finally, recovery. So recovery, and I'm just going to let the cat out of the bag ahead of time. Recovery in Active Directory against a cyber attack is a critical vulnerability, and potentially, I honestly can call it, it can be an existential threat to a company because of how hard it is to recover Active Directory from a cyber attack, and people don't know it. I'm not going to go very deep into this because I bored you for 45 minutes or a little less. But let me just say, this is serious, serious business. So this is a cyber attack recovery timeline from CDW, the data protection group in CDW that have done more than 100 incident response and data recovery. And it also happens to match the timeline that Microsoft put out in their most recent digital report, their security report. Now, the dwell time, I hear dwell time varies all over the place. I just read that the dwell time is down to just a few days now sometimes. And interestingly enough, they said that threat actors, as soon as they get in the environment, they go to Active Directory immediately within a matter of several hours to try to gain control of Active Directory. But what happens is there's the encryption event. Something, they're in there and they're starting to run their ransomware. It takes about 5 hours for the organization to identify that something is going on, an average of 5 hours. 12 hours to invoke the incident response plan, get Charlie back from fishing and where did this guy go and I can't find this guy and get everybody on the crisis bridge. Then you contact the cyber, and then as part of this you contact the cyber insurance and they go, whoa, hold your horses, I need to collect data, I need to understand what's going on. We need to bring in, typically the cyber insurance person will bring in their own negotiator and so everything kind of stops while they're getting that figured out. So that's about 24 hours or more. And then CDW says this takes, the forensic analysis may take a couple of days. Well, no, don't start recovering things because you're clobbering what we have. Then here's the big pole in the tent. So 21-day average, 5 to 14 days, really they say about 14 days for rebuilding primary IT functionality. That's Active Directory. That's recovering Active Directory. If it takes 20 to 21 days to rebuild basic IT functionality and 14 of those 21 days is rebuilding Active Directory, that's not a good thing. And that's if you've got working backups. Then data recovery, and then reestablish a basic production environment. This came out not long ago from the Microsoft Digital Defense Report. 76% of organizations lack effective cyber attack recovery and response plans. To this day, 76%. This is what it takes to recover, and I'm not going to go into detail on this. This is what it takes to recover Active Directory from a cyber attack. It's what's called forced recovery. If anyone, whenever I give a talk and I have AD people in the audience and I ask if someone has gone through forced recovery, someone raises their hand and you can see this ashen look on their face that they never want to go through it again. I kid you not, it's 29 steps you see here. For every domain that you have to go through these steps. Some of these steps take a long time and there's nothing you can do about it. For every domain controller in your environment, you have to do all of this. All of these things take time. And the only thing that a general purpose backup and recovery, the only step in this process that a general purpose backup can help you in is this one step right here. Everything else you have to do by hand, in the right order, while management is running around with its hair on fire, while you don't have regular communications because the threat actor has compromised your network and you're using FaceTime to look at what your operators are seeing on the computer screens across multiple locations. This is not something, so my takeaway for this is you need to talk to your AD people and say, look at your forced recovery. What is your forced recovery process? What is your cyber security recovery process? And really, is it adequate or not? My shameless plug here is we make a product that does it in 6 clicks and reduces it by 90% and restores the domain controllers without malware on them and allows you to find what the threat actor has been doing in the environment so you can restore your environment whole. Or, as security professionals, you can use this product to restore Active Directory into an isolated environment and go threat hunting on the bad guys and find out what they've done and formulate a plan to kick them out, which you can then apply in production. So to wrap up, Gartner recommends specific disaster recovery tools. Accelerate recovery from attacks by adding a dedicated tool for backup and recovery of Microsoft Active Directory. It's a dedicated tool for it, not a general purpose backup tool. I'll skip through the rest of that. These are all from Gartner reports saying how important this is and how important, as I said, it can be existentially complex to try to do this over days because your whole environment is down. Your production environment, no book, bill, ship is happening, anything. you can't even restore the applications completely until you can recover Active Directory. And I've already talked about Active Directory Forest Recovery. Fantastic product, and we have it in everywhere from small law firms to the largest retailer in the world, the largest airline in the world, the largest consulting companies in the world. So, identity is fundamental. I hope I've beaten that into you by now. If not, I'll beat you later. Security starts with identity. Mitigating identity risks requires ITDR solutions. I think, again, security depends on Active Directory. You've got that. Go forth and look at Purple Night in your environment if you're an Active Directory person, or even if you're not. Run Purple Night and look at your environment and see what it tells you and see what gaping holes you have to help make it harder for bad guys to get in your environment. And evaluate, should you be so inclined, more sophisticated ITDR-related tools to shore up, let's face it, what is as fundamental as your network nowadays to make your company, to make your business run. And that's it. Those are some of our wonderful things that people have loved about the company. I won't dwell on it, and that's a shameless plug for my podcast right there. I should have brought my cap or something like that. I've got about 50 episodes on identity security. And I think they're pretty interesting, but I might be a little bit biased. And that's it. So if any questions or whatever, go get the beer and wine. Speaking of getting the wine, go ahead. I could use a sip. Sure, go ahead.
Where is your podcast available? Is it on Spotify?
We're all your finer podcast purveyors. It's on Spotify and yeah, it's just look up Hybrid Identity Protection Podcast, and it's all over the place. I've got a batch. We just did I was the moderator and MC for our annual conference in New York City at the Microsoft office in Times Square, which was pretty cool. And I'm going to have a bunch more recordings coming out, both from those presentations and some interviews that I did, and yeah, from there.
You didn't mention Microsoft Defender for Identity.
MDI.
Yeah. How does Semperis get more features, I suppose, right?
So what the gentleman is talking about is a capability from Microsoft called Microsoft Defender for Identity. And what Microsoft Defender for Identity is, it's a hybrid service. There are agents that you put on domain controllers on premises, and they feed up data into a cloud service. And what MDI focuses on is client behavior into Active Directory. So they're looking for attacks like pass the hash, or it uses predictive analytics, behavioral analytics, to show, oh, well, look, Jim Bob and this computer has always gone off. He's queried Active Directory to access this file server and at 11 o'clock in the morning, pretty much every day. And now he's asking to access the SQL database at 2 a.m., which has never happened before. Let's raise an alert. So MDI, broadly, I describe MDI as focusing on the client behavior towards Active Directory. Whereas what, for example, Directory Service Protector does is it looks inside Active Directory to see if any changes are being made. So MDI looks for unusual user behavior that involves Active Directory queries. And we are on the other side, on the inside, that says, has a threat actor injected the well-known SID of the domain administrators into the SID history attribute, thereby giving them domain administrator rights, though they don't show up in any group. Does that explain it? We think of them as complementary. Yes?
So this seems like it would be a good product for most companies that have an AD guy. What about small companies that don't really have an AD expert? They've been limping around without one because they've never needed one. How easy is this to set up and implement, and how much resources does it take? Because I'm assuming you're taking essentially a robocopy of your entire AD structure in case you do need to restore it. So how much of a hardware resource is this application?
Right. Well, so we're talking about two different applications. What I would recommend for the the person that doesn't have an AD guy, which I think statistically is most organizations, they're peanut buttered across a whole bunch of things. You have to be pretty big to have a dedicated identity guy. Run Purple Night, because it'll say, look, you got this gaping hole, here's where it is, here are the steps you should take to mitigate it. Number one. Number two, for forest recovery purposes, that's ADFR, Active Directory Forest Recovery, it's very easy to set up. It's a work, these are all Windows Server, ASP.NET applications on Windows Server. And you set up a management server and you put an agent on the domain controllers you want to protect. Our people, our technical deployment people, actually white glove install it with you for everybody. And then when it's done, we actually run a forest recovery with you, showing you how to do it. And as part of the subscription, every year, we will do the same thing. We'll have, and our technical delivery people, CJ is the former Active Directory expert of Ford Motor Company. John Dean, who used to run Active Directory for Southwest Airlines. We've got guys that are 20-year Microsoft Premier Field Alliance Active Directory experts. We like to joke that we have more Active Directory experts inside Semperis than inside or outside of Microsoft. So yeah, we work with you side by side, and then on a yearly basis, we'll do a forest recovery to make sure everything's working like it's supposed to.
You mentioned forest recovery 6 clicks that your company did. Is there a name for that method or program?
Yeah, that's what I'm alluding to is called ADFR, and it's got the, God, I love marketing names that make sense, Active Directory Forest Recovery. You know, it's not Entra ID or anything like that. It is what it does, Active Directory Forest Recovery. I think we'll be hanging around afterwards. I'm sure we'll be hanging around afterwards if you have any more questions, or we've got tchotchkes. I see the tchotchkes were pretty popular too. So thank you. Thanks for sticking around on a whatever night this is, Thursday night.